Imagine a giant piggy bank, but instead of a family saving up loose change, it belongs to an entire country. That's kind of how a government's budget works. Money comes in, money goes out. But what's the story with words like national debt and budget deficit? Why do we hear about them all the time in the news? And what do they actually mean? Let's decode the basics. No jargon, no boring lectures, just real-world explanations you can use. All right, let's start at the beginning. How does a country actually get its money? Think of a government like a household. Every year, your household gets money in, maybe from jobs, gifts, or selling lemonade. For governments, the big source of money is taxes. That could be the taxes taken from paychecks, taxes on businesses, sales taxes when folks buy stuff, or tariffs when products come from other countries. This whole pile of incoming money is what's known as government revenue. Next up, just like in a family where you've got to pay for groceries, rent, school supplies, and maybe the occasional pizza night, a government has things it needs to spend money on. This spending pays for hospitals, public schools, parks, armies, police, fixing roads, building bridges, space exploration, and much more. Each dollar spent goes towards something that helps run the country. So let's picture this with an animation. On the left side, you've got a big funnel labeled income. That's taxes, fees, and any other money the government collects. On the right side, another funnel pours money out, the spending side, covering schools, healthcare, roads, defense, and so on. Here's where the plot thickens. Sometimes, a government's income and spending don't quite match up. This is just like when you're planning your household budget. If you earn $1,000 a month, but you spend $200, you're in the negative. That extra $200, you either need to borrow it, dip into your savings, or figure out a way to earn more next month. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes and fees over a single year, it's called a budget deficit. Think of the deficit as the extra part, that overspending in just 1 year. If a government's income for 2024 is $2 trillion and it spends $2.5 trillion, the deficit for that year is $0.5 trillion. Let's rewind and break it down even simpler using a household analogy. Let's say your household plans to take a vacation, fix the car, pay for tuition, and cover all your regular bills. You write down all these costs and compare them to what you expect to make from your job this year. Oops, you realize you're going to spend more than you earn. To make up the difference, you put the extra on your credit card. That extra spent is your deficit for this year, and the balance piling up on your credit card is your total debt. That leads us to the next big phrase, national debt. If the budget deficit is how much more the government spends than it brings in over a single year, then the national debt is what you get when you add up all the deficits from this year, last year, and all the years before, minus anything the government managed to pay back. Imagine that your family spends $500 more than it earns every year and puts it all on a credit card. After 3 years, you've built up $1,500 on your card, plus interest. That total is your debt. For governments, substitute credit card for government bonds, a fancy IOU they sell to investors. But the idea is the same. The national debt is the running total of what the country still owes because year after year more was spent than brought in. To picture this visually, each year's deficit stacks up in the background like bricks. Year after year, if you keep running deficits, the wall grows taller, representing the growing national debt. Sometimes, the government might have a year where it doesn't run a deficit. It brings in as much money or more than it spends. That's called a surplus, and if there is a surplus, the government can use that extra to pay down the national debt. But to be real, that doesn't happen all that often in most countries. Why does the government need to borrow in the first place? Well, sometimes there are emergencies, like a pandemic, where the government has to spend way more than usual on healthcare, financial aid, and so on. Other times, the government makes choices to stimulate the economy, improve infrastructure, or tackle big projects, meaning they're okay with running a deficit in the short term. Let's return to our household. Sometimes, you decide it's worth getting a loan to fix a leaky roof or to pay for college, because these investments can help you stay safe or earn more in the future. Governments do the same, but they have to be careful, because too much debt can mean paying lots of interest, or running into trouble if people stop being willing to lend them more. Let's put the pieces together with some real-world examples. Imagine the country of Econland. In 2003, Econland collects $2 trillion in taxes, but needs to spend $2.3 trillion to cover schools, roads, hospitals, and pay off some old bills. That means Econland has a budget deficit of $300 billion in 2023. But here's the thing. This isn't the first year Econland has had a deficit. Let's say Econland's been running an average deficit of $200 billion every year for the past 10 years. All those annual deficits add up, and together, they create the national debt. Maybe Econland's national debt now stands at $2 trillion, the sum of all those shortfalls over time. Think about it this way. The budget deficit is like how much you overspend during one shopping trip. The national debt is like the total balance on your credit card after months or years of spending more than you earn. Governments borrow money in a special way. Rather than using a credit card, they sell government bonds to investors, banks, and sometimes even other governments. When someone buys a government bond, they're basically lending money to the government, which promises to pay it back in the future, plus a little interest. So where does the national debt live? It lives in all those bonds and promises to repay. Over time, as deficits keep adding up, the national debt grows. If a country runs a deficit every single year for 10 years, the national debt can pile up pretty quickly. Now, what happens if the government spends less than it collects in a year? Then there's a budget surplus. Think of this as the rare moment you get a big bonus at work, and instead of spending it, you use all that extra money to pay down your credit card balance. No deficit this year, and the family's debt starts to shrink. But in lots of countries, years with surpluses are less common than years with deficits. Why do some countries run bigger deficits and pile up more debt than others? Sometimes it's because they want to invest in new infrastructure like high-speed trains, bridges, or technology. Maybe they want to expand social services or cut taxes. If there's a recession, governments might spend more than usual to help people and businesses stay afloat. Or maybe they just can't cut spending without upsetting voters. Now, borrowing can make sense in some cases, just like it does for a family taking out a loan to buy a house or pay for education. But borrowing too much for too long can create issues. If a government's national debt gets too high, a big slice of the money it collects in taxes could end up going just to pay the interest on what it owes, instead of paying for schools or hospitals. That's like a family spending all its income on credit card payments with nothing left for groceries. Let's review with a quick snapshot. Think of the budget deficit as this year's overspending. If your household spends $200 more than it makes this month, that's your deficit for the month. The national debt is the total amount built up over time, the sum of this year's overspending, last year's, and every year before, minus any years you spent less than you earned. Let's use one last analogy. Picture your bank account with a little graph. Each year, if you spend more than you make, you see a little dip down. That's the deficit. Over time, those dips add up like a hole getting deeper each year. The depth of that hole, that's your debt. Whoa, important question. How do countries pay off their debt, or at least manage it? Governments can raise taxes to bring in more money, cut spending on services, or sometimes, if the economy grows fast enough, tax revenues go up without anyone needing to change the tax rate. Also, paying back old debt is a bit different for countries than for families. Governments have more tools and can even print money in some circumstances, though that's a whole different can of worms, as it can lead to inflation. Let's go over a rapid recap to lock it all in. Governments collect money mostly from taxes. They spend on things like defense, healthcare, education, infrastructure, and social programs. If they spend more than they collect in a given year, that's called the budget deficit. Think of it as 1 year's shortfall. To cover the deficit, the government borrows money, usually by selling bonds, and promises to pay it back later. The national debt is the total of all those years of borrowing, when deficits stack up year after year. If the government ever spends less than it collects, rare, but it happens, that's a surplus, which can be used to pay down the national debt. Just like in a household, the better you manage your money, the easier it is to avoid debt. But sometimes, borrowing is necessary to handle big expenses or emergencies, whether it's a family fixing the roof or a country fighting a pandemic. So the next time you see a headline saying government running a deficit or national debt hits record high, you'll know the deficit is the extra spent in a single year, while the debt is the total owed after years of spending more than earning. And just to wrap things up super clearly, a budget deficit is how much more a government spends than it earns in 1 year. The national debt is the total amount it owes over time. Understanding the difference helps you make sense of the news, see why countries borrow, and maybe even pick up a few tips for your own budget. Keep decoding and keep those financial brains sharp.